My name is Chris Wren. I'm the chair of the XDS Advisory Committee, and I really want to thank you guys for coming and joining us for our 5th year anniversary this year. I really appreciate it. So it's my honor to welcome our first speaker of the day. Alex Stein is a lead artist and outsource manager with Treyarch Activision. Alex has just a few years under his belt, having worked in the games industry for 20 years, even makes me feel old. And 15 of those years have actually been spent in the practice of external development. Alex has worked on some small titles like God of War, Transformers, and of course, Call of Duty. Would you please help me give a warm welcome to my friend, Mr. Alex Stein.
Hi everyone. As Chris said, I'm Alex Stein. My official title at Treyarch is Lead Artist for Outsourcing, where we work on Call of Duty. And our most recent title was Black Ops 3, which you may be surprised to know was the 3rd Black Ops title in the Call of Duty franchise. Black Ops 3 was my first title at Treyarch and my first Call of Duty title. I joined the production about a year and a half into production. It was a 3-year total production cycle, so about a year and a half of outsourcing, which started in earnest when I was brought on board. We have a pretty large internal studio, but we also had a pretty large external development size, which was kind of a first on the Call of Duty franchise. So I'm going to be speaking a lot about environment outsourcing. That was where the volume of our work was done. And when you have a high volume, obviously you need really clean production, clean documentation, you need good communication, and you need strong partnerships with your vendors. And that's really what I'm talking about today, how to leverage those partnerships, reduce the amount of work you need to do, and make sure you get all the assets you need back in the quality you need. Call of Duty Black Ops 3, we shipped DLC after we shipped, about 4 DLC packs, and then Zombies Chronicles, which was 8 remastered Zombies maps. I'm going to be coming back to that a little later in the talk. As I mentioned, environments was a huge part of what we did. We also looked at characters, weapons, and vehicles. I'll be talking about environments as, like I said, that's the volume of what we did. We outsourced over 2,000 props, probably a lot more than that, but it's a little difficult to say because of the way we package things. We support three different types of game modes. And the reason that's important is I think that a lot of what I'm talking about today does apply to AAA development, but also because we have these 3 modes that are almost 3 separate productions. It could apply to casual mobile games. It could apply to studios who are managing multiple projects, because that was a lot of the challenges I faced as the outsource manager, and what a lot of the solutions I came up with were aimed at fixing. So each game mode, which is campaign, which is traditionally a single player or a co-op mode, multiplayer, which is a competitive mode, and Zombies, which is a new mode that Treyarch introduced to the Call of Duty series a few years ago and has become very popular. They have their own schedules. They have somewhat different art styles. In the case of Zombies, a very different art style. And they have different milestones and producers. It really is like managing almost 3 different productions. Just to show a little bit of the kind of environment work we were doing in all 3 game modes. In campaign, this is a good example of how much was sent out. Same with multiplayer. And Zombies, as you can see, the art style for Zombies was very different than, say, multiplayer campaign. It was, in this case, sort of a 1920s or 1930s gangland Chicago with some Lovecraftian elements introduced. So I have a couple of philosophies. Actually, I have a lot of philosophies, but as regards outsourcing, there's 2 that I really stick to, and we'll be talking about those a lot today. The first one, which is constantly ask, what is the reason I'm doing something myself or that the team is doing it versus sending it out? Is it a good reason? And there are lots of good reasons. Maybe you're better at doing it. Maybe your support system is better internally. Maybe it's just something that can't be sent out for technical reasons. If it's not a good reason, then what's stopping you? If, for example, it's a tools issue, can you write a tool that can do it? But more often than not, what I've found is the reason we're not sending something out is because it just hasn't occurred to us. We haven't asked ourselves why we're not doing it. And when we sat down and thought about it, we realized there was a lot more we could be sending out and leveraging the experience and also the manpower of our external partners rather than trying to do everything ourselves. So I'll be talking about this one first and coming back to number 2 later. Outsourcing scheduling was falling largely on myself, especially as regards environments. And as I mentioned a couple of times now, we have 3 main game modes, almost like 3 different projects. Scheduling that becomes incredibly difficult. Every game mode here, campaign, multiplayer, and zombies, has its own schedule. I was trying to manage the various requirements and milestones of each for outsourcing, and then distribute that to 3 or 4 environment vendors to try and get everything back on time. It's obviously a very complicated and time-consuming task. In fact, I found myself only doing that and then neglecting other parts of my job. And I frankly wasn't getting it done. A lot of stuff was falling off my radar, slipping between the cracks. It was very difficult to keep everything synced. So I asked myself, why am I doing this? What is the reason I'm not leveraging some of the experience with our vendors a little more? And I was a bottleneck. So I decided to reapproach scheduling and put more faith in the production managers and producers and art directors at our various vendors. These are people with an incredible amount of experience. These are people who manage multiple projects all the time. These are people who are ready to do this work if you let them, or if you ask them to. So what we did was, we already have a naming convention for our assets that indicates which game mode they're for. We have milestones already established. We have relationships with the vendors. I decided, why aren't we just using that and letting them manage their own teams, which I frankly couldn't do anyway. So we'd send them assets from all 3 game modes, different levels, different milestones. We didn't have to explain which was for which because we exposed the naming conventions to them and let them know what they meant. And then we gave them milestones and priorities based on those levels and those game modes. So we could send a batch to one vendor that had assets from all 3 different game modes, but also different levels, different milestones, and know that they could slot things in correctly with their team to make sure everything that we needed was delivered on time. And we repeat that with 2 or 3 other vendors. So suddenly we're not trying to manage this sprawling production of different assets going to different vendors and trying to figure out how to get them all back in time. We're just sending everything out, knowing that they understand what the milestones are, when the requirements are. And more importantly, they can tell us immediately if something's not going to fall into place correctly. Then we can redistribute the workload, again, without having to reorganize everything from the start. What I was most interested in for myself was this last bullet point, keeping me informed as to how busy the team was. When are they going to be free? Do they have enough assets to work on to keep them busy? And if they don't, can we shift some over from another vendor, again, without this whole reworking of the schedule? So letting them handle their own schedules, letting them handle their own management, that allowed us to redistribute work very quickly and keep things within our milestones. The benefits of this, obviously, was it took a lot of work off of my plate, but frankly, work that wasn't getting done anyway. So suddenly things started to fall into place a lot more easily. It also let us use the expertise of their coordinators. But the long-term benefit, to me, was a lot stronger. The production coordinators and producers at our vendors are incredibly important people to me now. I work with them very closely because there's a certain amount of trust now that they're carrying our scheduling on their backs as well. And they understand the importance of hitting milestones. So I don't have to constantly be checking on the status of each asset. They understand when they're due, they're keeping me updated. When I find out that an artist is being swapped out at a vendor, that's a concern, but it's not the end of the world. When I find out a production coordinator or a producer is being swapped out, I get pretty concerned, and I want to know why. I want to know who's coming in their place, whether there's going to be transition, what the training is. I want to have a long conversation with them because I'm relying on them to maintain the schedule. Did it work? Sure. This one's working now. It's still working. There's always hiccups. There's always things that we didn't prioritize correctly, that the team maybe didn't let me know they needed, that I wasn't aware of, and we have to adjust quickly, but that's why it is working. I can call them and reorganize tasks and know that they'll reschedule everything else to fit. It's something we're still doing today. The second one of these little tenets or philosophies is, this is a big part of how I manage outsourcing at Treyarch. I want the most work we can get, the highest quality we can get with the absolute minimal impact to the internal team. For those of you who are here at the keynote speech or the panel just an hour, half hour ago, one of the speakers mentioned this. They said, you know, you have to be careful if you have someone who's brought on board to be an artist or a lead artist or a point artist, and suddenly they're reviewing outsourced assets all day, or they're writing up packages or whatever it is that they didn't really sign up for. We do have people at Treyarch who are very happy managing outsourcing. We have people who, frankly, aren't as interested in it. But my goal is to make sure we get it done for their department, whether or not they're someone who really wants to be involved in it or wants to simply supervise it from a higher position. I'm very, very conscious of the term of borrowed time. I don't want to work on someone else's borrowed time, which means that they have a full day's worth of tasks of their own to get done, and they have to squeeze in outsourcing. Outsourcing needs to be supported, and it needs to be supported by someone invested in it. So we've created the position of outsourcing coordinators. On Black Ops 3, on the environment side, there were 4 of these guys and girls. These are generally entry-level positions. These are people who have that rare combination of an art background, but also great communication skills, good organizational skills. They think outside of themselves. They're not parked at their desk working on assets all day. They're actually out talking to other team members. They're sort of filling the gaps between the outsourcing group and the internal teams. They're actually embedded with internal teams. This, again, was for environment, but we use the same model for characters, for weapons, for vehicles, and for other areas we're exploring now. The team has actually tripled in size. On environments, one of the main tasks they're responsible for is packaging up assets. So on the left there, the little blueprint is an asset request. That request is broken out into, in our case, a text document explaining what we need and how we want it built, some reference images, and perhaps an example file or a legacy file. That's all put together in a package. It's actually more time-consuming than you would think, especially gathering reference images from the web. We looked into it and we were realizing we were spending all our time doing that. So the structure as it sort of evolved was we had a seemingly endless amount of asset requests. We had the 4 asset outsource coordinators, which was really more like 3.5 because one of the more experienced coordinators was actually responsible for integrating all assets that came in, checking them for technical fidelity, making sure they met all the artistic requirements. So his time was pretty limited in terms of packaging assets. We realized that at an average, we were packaging at most about 2 assets a day per coordinator. And then we had this huge workforce outside the studio waiting to start work. So you can see where the bottleneck is there. That led to the same question that I keep asking. What are we doing internally that's slowing things down that can be sent out? And it seemed hard in this case because asset packaging is actually kind of micro art direction. You're taking a concept that may not be very clear. You're taking maybe even something that was just mentioned in a meeting, and you're putting together reference, and you're talking to design and figuring out how the context of it. You're talking to art direction, make sure that you've got the right version or the right feel that they want, and then you're putting it all together and getting it out there. That really is the art direction being given to the external artist. So it's a pretty big responsibility, and it's something that's kind of difficult to think about outsourcing. But we decided to try anyway. So what we realized was we have all these guys waiting overseas or in various locations waiting for assets to come to them, and we have all these assets ready to go. What if we asked them to do some of the packaging themselves? And it's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to pitch to the studio. You're basically relinquishing a little more control over what gets sent to them, obviously, but you may be increasing throughput quite a bit. And then they could actually work on the assets themselves once the packages were approved by us. If we were able to do this, we could take these valuable outsourced coordinators who were busy doing this all day, and actually they could start doing some other stuff. Our documentation was falling behind. There were other things we wanted to explore outsourcing that they didn't have time for. There was quality control of packages that was slipping because we didn't have enough time to look at everything in every package, and especially technical auditing in terms of material use, texture use. And we could also help with performance profiling and all these other things that people inside the studio are best prepared to do. The best test example for this was Zombies Chronicles. As I mentioned, this was sort of after our DLC season. We shipped this in this year. It is 8 classic maps. So Treyarch was, obviously, our fans are very passionate about zombies, and it's something we wanted to bring back some of the maps that they consider classics and and bring them up to date with our current engine. This was something that the outsourcing team was going to be very heavily involved in. If we were going to be able to ship this in 2017 while at the same time wrapping up DLC and start gearing up on our next game, we were going to have to send out quite a bit of the artwork. And in fact, we started doing that before anybody internally was really focused on Zombies Chronicles, because we could get the asset list, we knew what we had to upres, and we could get them started. But we also looked at it as this huge mountain of work that we had to get through, and in a very short amount of time. And just doing the math, even with 4, even adding a few more coordinators, we weren't going to get through it all. And that's when we said, look, this is a perfect opportunity to try this out. I'll just go into one asset. It's a kind of a nondescript asset, but it demonstrates a lot of what we were hoping for and what we actually achieved. On the left, there is the trunk that shipped with the original map. It's a standard theater trunk, metal and cardboard. On the right is what we eventually got back from our outsourcing vendors who were upresing assets for us. Now, on the first glance, it does all the stuff you want in an upres. A lot of things that were normally just textures are now built out in geometry. The materials feel a lot more real. The metal and the cardboard are all PBR compliant. But what I've circled there in the handle was what really opened our eyes to why this was working. In the original asset, the handle's missing. And if I showed you the open version of this, there was hinges that weren't there where the lid and the box met. And obviously you can't see them here, but they were there in that one as well. That was the first time that we saw a vendor sort of say, look, we know what is important to Treyarch. And what's important to Treyarch when we're reviewing assets is construction techniques. How are things fitted together? How are 2 pieces of wood joined? What kind of nail is used? What kind of bolt is used? How do metal and cardboard interact? What elements make something actually real usable object versus just a box that looks like a trunk? We've been hammering on this for a year and a half, or 2 years by the time they got to this asset. It was something we gave constant feedback on. And it was rewarded here. They added that handle without us saying a word. In fact, I don't even know if we would have called it out in our original package. We may have noticed it later, but they found that. They looked at they found their own reference. They did their own dives and realized in the original asset, there was no way to pick that thing up. It's a small detail. It doesn't mean a whole lot in the local view of this asset, but when taken as a whole, it's a great indication that all of our art direction, all the work we had put into training these external artists to the way we wanted things built was paying off. And we saw this time and again, little construction details that meant a lot to us and that help us create the Treyarch look. So there are obviously some immediate benefits. The more packages you get through, obviously the more content we finish. And something like Zombies Chronicles, that was essential. We weren't going to ship unless we could get through quite a few assets in a very short time. Again, our outsourced coordinators become free to work on more important things. Hero assets, there are just some assets that you cannot have the vendor do an asset dive on because it's a piece of concept art. It's something important to the studio. There isn't enough time to really detail it out by concept artists. We need to provide our own reference for that. Our outsourced coordinators are now branching out into other areas and areas that we might want our vendors to follow in. But the long term is what's really important to me, because I think there's going to be a shift in the way we art direct and provide feedback. We've been very rigid, and we've been very clear about what we want, and we call out these little details all the time. It's not a criticism of them, and it's sort of how we work internally too, but we're always looking for this fine detail, and it leads to a lot of feedback and kind of a boxing in or a railroading of the boundaries of where vendors feel like they can go on their own. When we allow them to stretch out a little bit and they reward us with things like I showed you with the handle, then we realize maybe we can back off a little bit on that and let them do it themselves, let them explore themselves and kind of add things on their own. I think it is working. I feel like our long-term vendors, the ones we spend a lot of time with, no longer feel like they're so constrained that they can actually push more of their own talent into these assets. That's a huge deal for us. So did it work? Yeah, I'd say it's working to some degree. Something like Zombies Chronicles, where all the assets were available already in their legacy form, it wasn't that tough. It was more of a mental shift and a sort of a leap of faith. With more concepted pieces, if you played Black Ops 3, a lot of our environment was in the near future, or I think about 50 to 70 years out. That stuff's a little harder. We need to be a little more conscious of the fact that we're going after a specific art style, and the vendors are still learning that, and maybe it's not fair to ask them to just create assets on their own. But there's always going to be opportunities, and we should be looking for them. It's more about trust in your vendors. It's more about forming that same partnership you have with your internal artists and letting them stretch out a little bit. And for me, it's more about, again, taking things off your plate and utilizing the expertise that you have available to you. If you just are having them do art, that's great. We've done that for a long time. The more you try these other things, the more you try to clear internal bottlenecks externally, I think you'll be a lot more rewarded. So again, this is still something we're trying. The scheduling thing, I think we're pretty good on. The assets, again, it's hit and miss, but it really depends on how well prepared they are and how unique that asset is to your art style. But it's all about confidence. It's about understanding that they're ready. I don't know a single vendor out there who isn't striving to add quality to what you're asking them to do, who doesn't want to do better than what you ask them to do. And frequently what's holding them back is that you're maybe not letting them explore that as much. Okay? All right, thanks a lot, everyone. Enjoy the conference.